Hey guys, thanks for coming back to this channel here, this tactical intellectual channel. We have a presentation on the melanated original German inhabitants right there. The title of this presentation is Braun and Schwarz, but since I'm from the USA, I'm gonna say Braun and Schwarz, to anglify it. So that just means like brown and black right there. Braun and Schwarz, brown and black. So this presentation right here will be a series of presentations, and it, like the others, will be specific to the country, region, or area of Europe. And in this case, I'm talking about Germany right here. So we're going to go over the original inhabitants of Germany. I guess different migrations of melanated people, then non-melanated people, then clashes or what have you. And we're going to try to lead it up to today in our time. So let's get on into the information here. And of course, we're going to go refer and draw from the book Origins of the Anglo-Saxon Race by Louis Earl Shore, Thomas William Shore. Actually, before we delve into Origin of the Anglo-Saxon Race, let's go look at J.A. Rogers' book Sex and Race and see what he has to say regarding the Germans. Chapter 17 of the book Sex and Race, Volume 1, Negro White Mixing in Germany, reads, in the matter of ancient Negro strain, Germany seems to be no different from the other countries mentioned. The famous Neanderthal skull, the oldest Negro type known, was discovered at Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856. There are other abundant archaeological evidences also, Professor Dixon says, in Mecklenburg and Silesia in the southeast. It was the Proto-Negroid type which was in the majority. He also thinks that an early Negro people inhabited eastern Norway. Julius Caesar undoubtedly took Negroes in his legions to Germany. The skull of an ancient Negro was found at Cologne. The Huns, a Negro-Mongolian people who overran Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, also contributed much towards the present German stock. The Huns had swarthy skins, flat noses, and frizzly hair. Jordanes, a writer of the 6th century who saw them, says, they made their foes flee in horror because their swarthy aspect was fearful. Of Attila, their greatest leader, who is called the Scourge of God, Jordanes says he had a flat nose and a swarthy complexion, showing the evidences of his origin. McRitchie says, too, that certain of the Danish tribes living in northwestern Germany were, like the Moors, black. Let's turn our attention to Origin of the Anglo-Saxon Race, a study of the settlement of England and the tribal origin of the Old English people. Just to add context so that you guys are not lost, on page 106 is talking about the brunette complexioned people who inhabited Norway. They were Norwegian. Now, just to read, it says, starting at and this has been referred by anthropologists to a very ancient settlement there of the prehistoric brown race that survives in the highlands of Central Europe and is known as the brown Alpine race. This race is believed to have extended before the dawn of history much further northwards in Germany. So right here I have the keynote slide that says the German originals, and these are just the sources that shapes my opinions regarding the original or primitive beginnings of Germany, that Germanic region. So the sources that I will draw from are Racial History of Man, Races of Europe, Environment, Race, and Migration, Sex and Race Volume 1, and also Origin of the Anglo-Saxon Race. And I've already gave you guys a sample of Sex and Race Volume 1 and Origins of the Anglo-Saxon Race. So let's go ahead and proceed. And this is the beginnings right here. So we're going to go to the next source. So as you can see, the next source we go into will be the Racial History of Man book by Roland Dixon. And as you can see, he's the professor of anthropology at Harvard University from back in the day. So we're going to check out the beginnings and the building blocks of the Germanic area. And I'm definitely going to read from it. I'm going to give a little comment and then move on. So let's proceed. So now we go into the book Racial History of Man, Book 1, Chapter 4, pages 98 through 112. And disclaimer that there's a lot of information here, so combination of reading and skimming. So we're going to be dealing with Germany, the old Czechoslovakia, and Austria, all that Germanic area here. Gonna lump them all together. All right, so page 98 reads, the area occupied by Germany, the new state of Czechoslovakia and Austria, includes two quite different kinds of country. While the geographical divisions thus run in a general way east and west, the language divisions run at right angles to them, since while the whole central and western portions of the region are occupied by Teutonic speaking peoples, a large area in the east comprising most of Czechoslovakia and the northeastern borders of Germany is prevailingly or largely of Slavic speech. In studying their racial history of this whole region, we are able to begin our investigation in early Paleolithic times. The Neanderthal skull is dolichocephalic and low, and although the facial parts are wanting on the analogy of other crania regarded as of the same human variety, it is safe to assume that the nose is broad so that the skull would, on the basis of the scheme of classification here adopted, belong to the Proto-Australoid type. It is thus similar to the crania of the same period already noted in France. From the southeastern corner of the area in Bohemia, two crania of Aurignacian age at the beginning of the late Paleolithic period are known. The face of the bronze skull was probably narrow, suggesting that the nose was narrow also. And if this is true, then we should have here the Mediterranean rather than the Proto-Australoid type, indicating the same change of type in Aurignacian times as already noted for France. Quite recently, two crania of the later Magdalenian period have been described from Oberkassel near Bonn. These fortunately have their facial parts well preserved and afford evidence which seems to corroborate the suggestion just put forward. For the male skull is clearly a blend between the Mediterranean and Caspian types. The female skull, on the other hand, is a blend between the Proto-Australoid and Proto-Negroid and may be regarded as representing the older Paleolithic stratum. Right, so drop down a little bit and it says the types represented are further quite contrasted. For the Mediterranean type is the dominant and most important dolichocephalic factor in the case of the males, whereas it is the Proto-Negroid which is most strongly represented among the dolichocephalic minority in the females. What conclusions may be drawn from these facts? Taking into consideration the data from other parts of Europe, I believe we may say that in the early Paleolithic period, the southern portion of the area under discussion was occupied by people belonging primarily to the Proto-Australoid type that Later in Aurignacian times, the Mediterranean type appeared here, as it did coincidentally in France. Still later in Magdalenian times, the influence of the Caspian type came in from the eastward, while at the very end of the Paleolithic period, we find evidence of a strong element of Mongoloid type, which in the Neolithic period was to be strongly represented in the Ardennes or Ardennes Plateau, somewhat further west. Moving on to page 101, it says, in Mecklenburg in the northwest and in Silesia in the southeast, it was the Proto-Negroid type which was in the majority, with a minority of Proto-Australoid along the Baltic shores. In Bohemia, on the other hand, the Caspian type was dominant, the Proto-Negroid and Mediterranean taking second place. From an analysis of the data, it appears that the older Bunderamic is found mainly associated with crania of Proto-Australoid and Proto-Negroid types, whereas the later chord-marked variety occurs with Caspian and Mediterranean types. Alright, so drop down some. The North German plain, Czechoslovakia, and Austria appear to have retained the predominant dolichocephaly by which they were characterized throughout Neolithic times, but an increase in the proportions of the Mediterranean type is to be noted in the southeast. The southwest of Germany, however, shows a striking change in that here we find a strong infusion of Alpine and Paleo-Alpine types, especially along the Rhine Valley, where they can be traced as far as Worms or beyond. I drop down a little bit into this region along the Baltic had come in early Neolithic times remnants of the Paleolithic Proto-Australoids and Proto-Negroids of France and southern Germany, displaced by the incoming Mediterranean and Caspian peoples from the south and east. Later, these newer type, and particularly the latter themselves, made their way into the northern lands in force, and they're in relative isolation and little disturbed by the streams of Pale-Alpine and Alpine immigrants who revolutionized conditions in Central and Western Europe. These dolichocephalic factors amalgamated to produce that blend in the main of Caspian and Mediterranean types, which has come to be called the Nordic race. So page 103, the highlighted portion reads, the point of view adopted in the present study, the Nordic race, is primarily a blend of two radically different types, which it is believed developed locally in the Baltic lands during the Neolithic and early Metal Ages. Alright, page 104, bottom portion reads, in Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse, both sexes show a predominance of dolichocephalic factors. In the Slavic, can't even pronounce that. Okay, let me try it. Rehengraber. Although this is true of the males, in whom the Proto-Australoid, Caspian, and Proto-Negroid types appears, the females have a majority of the opposite factors and are in the main of Alpine and Pale-Alpine types. 105, bottom portion reads, in the period from the 9th to the 14th centuries, the south of Germany, Bavaria, Württemberg, still retained a strong majority of Nordic dolichocephals, at least among the males. In Bavaria, however, the females are sharply contrasted in that they have a preponderance of Pale-Alpine and Alpine types. In Bohemia, farther to the east, the change has already affected the males, who now are like the females, overwhelmingly brachycephalic in character. Page 106 reads, In Westphalia, along the border of the Low Countries, the population seems to have been almost purely dolichocephalic, with the Mediterranean type strongly dominant. In Thuringia, farther eastward, Palealpine factors attain considerable importance, although dolichocephalic types are still in the majority. Let's drop down some. The northern and southern tectonic groups are alike, at least in their brachycephalic factors, in that each shows this to be mainly of alpine type. They differ, on the other hand, in their dolichocephalic elements, the northern or Baltic group being composed mainly of Mediterranean and Caspian factors, whereas the southern group has a large representation of the Proto-Australoid type. The northern group has moreover a larger brachycephalic factor than the southern. The northern and southern Slavic groups, on the other hand, differ more from each other than do the tectonic, for the southern group shows a large factor of the Palealpine type, which the northern does not possess, while the latter has a considerable Mediterranean element which is lacking in the south. As in the case of the tectonic groups, however, the north has the larger proportion of brachycephals. In the south of the tectonic and Slavic groups alike were intrusive peoples and apparently prevailingly dolichocephalic in an area which had previously been occupied by a brachycephalic population. In the north, on the contrary, only the Slavic tribes were immigrants, since the North German plain was the homeland of the tectonic tribes. It would naturally be supposed that both Teuton and Slav in the north would be at least as strongly dolichocephalic as their respective southern offshoots. Yet, in fact, each is less so, in both northern groups. Teuton as well as Slav show an unexpected strength of brachycephalic factors in a region previously characterized by long-headedness. How is this paradox to be explained? The Pomeranian Slavs show but a fraction of the alpine factors present in the Wendish or Wendish crania from Mecklenburg, which region in Neolithic times, it will be remembered, was almost purely dolichocephalic, so that the Slavs cannot be regarded as responsible for this brachycephalic element, a belief confirmed by the fact that the Slavic crania from still farther eastward in Posen and Prussia reveal even a smaller round head or headed element than is found in Pomerania, in Westphalia and Friesland on the west, in Denmark and Sweden on the north. The population of this period was prevailingly dolichocephalic, so that the source of this strong alpine factor in both Teuton and Slav in northwestern Germany is extremely puzzling. Okay, let's drop down some. Let us return again to the consideration of Bavaria and the southern portion of the whole region. We have seen it that in the medieval period between the 6th and the 14th centuries, the population of Bavaria had changed from one which was in majority dolichocephalic and Mediterranean type to one in which these factors were barely in excess of alpine elements. Some 6 or 7 centuries later, in Bohemia, the change had been more rapid, and by the 12th century, the people here were primarily brachycephalic, the Palealpine type being markedly in predominance. Where in Bavaria in the 14th century, the proportion of dolichocephalic factors was still slightly in excess of the brachycephalic. 400 years later, the actual dolichocephalic crania had dropped to less than 1%, while the pure brachycephalic crania make up more than 80% of the total, a proportion which is equaled, if not exceeded, in Baden and Austria and among the Slavic population of Czechoslovakia. With few exceptions, it is the Alpine type which is everywhere clearly the dominant factor, although among the Slavic group, the women show a large majority of the Paleolithic type. There has been thus in southern Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia since early medieval times a radical change in the character of the population. From a prevailingly long-headed people, they have become an almost purely round-headed one. Yet, in the intervening period of roughly 1,000 years, we know of no extensive migrations or movements which would account for the change. Before attempting to discuss the cause of this modification, we must first consider the modern population of the North German plain and note that the results obtained from the study of the living people. All right, that was a ton of reading right there, and we're going to break this up and dissect it and, just speak about the gray area and what is this really saying. And you know what, at least we got some time periods and dates to work with, so we can clean all of this mystery up. So now we enter into the phase where we quasi wrap this video presentation up by presenting pieces of facts and evidence to put things into better context. I'm going to add some tidbits of information from other sources that adds more clarity to things, like terms such as Mediterranean peoples and what have you, other things. So by video's end, you know where everything is situated at from an intellectual standpoint, and just for honesty's sake. So now we go back to the book Racial History of Man, chapter 4, page 98, the beginning of that chapter. The area in question is modern day Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, parts of Belgium, parts of Russia, Poland. That's the geographic area in question right there. So what time period are we looking at? Well, going back to page 98, if you look down, you see that it's the Paleolithic period. That's the time period right there. So that's key. We have the geographic area and the time period. On the bottom portion of page 98, we start to get into the territory where we examine the types of people. Now, check out where it says that the Neanderthal skull is dolichocephalic and low. And then it's saying that, okay, the facial parts are wanting. Let's go ahead and see what human variety that is. On page 99, when you continue, they say that it's safe to assume that the nose is broad. And all right, the classification here being adopted belong to the proto-australoid type. So they say that it is thus similar to the crania of the same period already noted in France. Now, in my What's Your Type video series, I already put up how the proto-australoids look. Okay, so we're gonna do a brief rundown of the proto-australoids. Their current day counterpart looks like this. You see the picture of the two women here. See their complexion, see their facial features. Okay, see this family here, see their complexion, see their facial features. Third picture of the man, see his complexion, see the facial features. Now let's hit the books and be brief about it. So page 98 of the book Environment, Race, and Migration by Griffith Taylor, it says under the subheading Status of the Australians, one of the difficult problems of ethnology is to discover the relative positions of the Australians and Negroes in the ethnological scale. It seems to me that the geographic evidence is helpful here. we may assume that the lower Melanesian is comparable to the lower African Negro. Now, let's move on to page 133. The bottom portion of that page says, apart from the hair, there is no very striking difference between the Australoids and Negroes, but hair texture is universally admitted to be of great importance. And in the Australoids, it is almost universally wavy rather than curly and never frizzy. This places them biologically nearer the central racial zones. It is of interest that Saracen records that the newborn New Caledonian Negro has wavy hair, which is replaced after the first week or so by the usual kinky Negro hair. So that kinky hair is possibly a secondary characteristic or character acquired by Negro peoples. So you can do with that information as you will, but to me the main point was that they said apart from the hair, there is no very striking difference between Australoids and Negroes. So that little tidbit of information, that gives me further context to put things in proper order when it comes to this whole subject. You know, Proto-Australoids, Proto-Negroes, and even another group. But let's go ahead and cover that first. So let's go ahead and head back to the book Racial History of Man. Continuing on page 99, we're going to start off at from. So it says, from the southeastern corner of the area in Bohemia to Crania of Aurignacian age. Aurignacian is just the beginning of the late Paleolithic period, but they are known in the area. So it say that the face of the bronze skull was probably narrow, but then it mentions that we should have here the Mediterranean rather than the Proto-Australoid type. So then drop down a little bit, it says that, okay, the skull is well preserved and it has some commonality with what you already found in France, of course. But it says that, all right, the male skull is clearly a blend of the Mediterranean and Caspian type. The female skull, on the other hand, is a blend between the Proto-Australoid and Proto-Negroid. So what does that tell you right there? Okay, so you had Australian, Proto-Australoid people, Negro people, of course, Mediterranean people, all living in the area, and they were mingling and mixing, having lots of sex with each other, producing children, all that stuff. So these were the, the indigenous people of the area, the first peoples to move in here before the latecomers came. So now we're going to go into the book Environment, Race, and Migration and see what the Mediterranean people are. So on page 162 of the book Environment, Race, and Migration, it says under the subheading Entry of the Modern Races. In early Neolithic times, we reach a period when the major races of Europe entered that continent. There seems little doubt that these newcomers made use of the ancient corridor along the Mediterranean shores. They are perhaps most typically represented in their primitive state by the Somali and Gala peoples in Ethiopia today. And we may picture similar folk moving throughout most of the lowlands of Europe in early Neolithic times. They constitute the Mediterranean race, which is found still in the majority in southern Italy, southern Greece, Corsica, Sardinia, west Spain, Portugal, Wales, Devon, Ireland, and West Scotland. So here's a JSTOR article, the Gala or Oromo people of East Africa. Here's a visual on Google Images, Gala peoples. As you can see, all right, melanated people of East Africa, and we know what Somalis look like. So on the notebook, we have Proto-Australoid, Proto-Negro or Negroid, Mediterranean, Caspian so far. All right, let's move on back to Racial History of Man. Page 99, the bottom portion says, the types represented are further quite contrasted, for the Mediterranean type is the dominant and most important dolichocephalic factor in the case of the males, whereas it is the Proto-Negroid which is most strongly represented among the dolichocephalic minority in the females. Now on page 100, they say that the conclusions that may be drawn from the facts are, okay, so the data from the other parts of Europe, they can say that in the Paleolithic period that people that occupied the areas, they were primarily Proto-Australoid, and then later on in the Aurignacian times, the Mediterranean types of people came in. That's that commonality that they shared with France. Well, Germany had that too. Then the Caspian types start coming from the east, and then they say at the very end of the Paleolithic period, they find evidence of what? A strong element of Mongoloid type people. So there you have it. In that Neolithic period, you had how many types of people coming in? You had Proto-Australoid, Proto-Negroid, Mediterranean, Caspian, even Alpine was up in there, and then the Mongoloid type. So let's bring up that notebook and let's round it out. Mongoloid type. Now check out page 101. We're talking about Mecklenburg there in the northwest and in Silesia in the southeast. What do they say? Okay, Proto-Negroid type was in the majority, with the minority of Proto-Australoid people along the Baltic shores. In Bohemia, it was the Caspian types that was dominant, followed by the Proto-Negroid and Mediterranean folks. Now, you see, it says that in the Bankaramic period, it is found mainly associated with the crania of the Proto-Australoid and Proto-Negroid types. So they say that a later chord marked variety occurs with Caspian and Mediterranean types. So just think about that for a minute. You know, dark-skinned Negro people with straighter hair, dark-skinned Negro people with more frizzy type hair, and then you have Caspian and then Mediterranean type people who are basically East Africans. Think about it. Okay, so now the bottom of page 101, we talk about a little geography here. The areas in question are the North German Plain, the old Czechoslovakia area, along with Austria. Now, I mention all of that because those areas were predominantly dolichocephalic when it comes to their population in Neolithic times. But then that area saw an increase of the Mediterranean type in the southeast. Now, check out southwest Germany. We see that it said that a change happened. There was an infusion of the Alpine and Palealpine types along the Rhine Valley. So keep in mind that a time period now is Neolithic. Now, the bottom portion of page 102, we see that along the Baltic, the Paleolithic Proto-Australoids and Proto-Negroids of France and southern Germany, they were displaced by the Mediterranean and Caspian type people from the south and east. Okay, so with all of that in mind, what is the natural conclusion that we can have? So in the orange highlighted portion, notice how it says that, okay, these dolichocephalic factors amalgamated to produce a blend, Caspian, Mediterranean, so on and so forth, but they were referred to as the Nordic race. And on page 103, we have more information on this Nordic race. It says that, okay, the time period was during the Neolithic age and early Metal age periods right there. These are basically what? A blend of two types of people who are radically different. So, I mean, there was something developing right there in that area, the Baltic area. Okay, I might have more information on that, but that's just something that you can remember to put things in proper context, so you can just have a better view and outlook of what took place in history. Page 104, here's the locations in Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse. Hesse is a big one. We're going to use that. You're going to hear about Hesse later on, where it says that both sexes, male and female, show a predominance of dolichocephalic factors. Okay. The Proto-Australoid, Caspian, and Proto-Negroid types, they all appear and have a presence in those areas there. So let's go ahead and go on to page 105. On page 105, we have time periods to work with from the 9th century to the 14th centuries in the south of Germany, Bavaria, Württemberg. Okay, so it says that they had a type of Nordic dolichocephalic population there. We're gonna discuss what this Nordic element is, but we're not gonna do it right now. So in Bohemia, they say there's a preponderance of Palealpine and Alpine types. Keep in mind the Negrito population, they had a presence there, and I want to say that was the Palealpine. So now it mentions that in Bohemia, further to the east, there was a shift from dolichocephalic to brachycephalic. On page 106, it mentions how in Westphalia, the population was basically dolichocephalic, with the Mediterranean type people being strongly repped. Now, in Thuringia, to the east, the Palealpine, aka Negrito factors, they were still important and in the majority. So we're gonna drop down. What do we have here? Okay, the Alpine type representation and the presence of Mediterranean and Caspian people. Also, Proto-Australoid people had a representation. Okay, don't want to get too deep in this one. We're gonna do that later on because it's talking about later periods. When we're already out of the Paleolithic, the Neolithic times. We're already in the medieval times right here on page 106. So then 107, I mean, we're already talking about the Teutonic population, but what do I want to highlight here? All right, so on 107, the bottom portion, it is basically time period based. I'm not getting too deep into this part just yet. Like 106 and 107, even 108, I'm not going to get too deep into that because it deals with later time periods and later types of people. The big takeaway on the bottom portion of page 107 deals with time period and people. Now it says we're dealing with Bavaria and the southern portion of Germany as a whole. Now we're in the medieval period, and it says that between the 6th and 14th centuries, the population of Bavaria is still dolichocephalic Mediterranean type people, and we know what that is. So going on page 108, it says that only like 6 or 7 centuries later do another element come to play or come into that area. So Bohemia, the change was probably by the 12th century. So I mean, you had dolichocephals, then you had the brachycephalic people came in, and I mean, keep in mind it says that the Palealpine type were predominant. So I mean, just looking at the rest of them, I'm skimming over it right now, but okay. Check out the orange highlighted portion on page 108. It says that there has been thus in southern Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia since the early medieval times a radical change in the character of the population. So Before attempting to discuss the cause of the modification, they must consider the modern population of the North German plain. Okay, so I mean, we're talking about the original people, the Paleolithic and Neolithic times, and so now I can speak freely and not be beholden to source material. I can speak it, I can put things together now. This is the real content now, so I'm going to speak on the real content that I pieced together. The source material is what shaped my I guess outlook on this topic here. So I'm going to put together those colored terms, those forenames, surnames. This right here is proof from a skeletal remains aspect or angle. So I got that. Then we have family crests. Then we have place names. So that's the formula I'm using. So what conclusion will I come up with? It's the one that you see, the character of this whole platform. So we're walking up to the conclusion of this video presentation here. To summarize, when it comes to these early Germanic peoples, we know that they were referred to as Proto-Australoid, Proto-Negroid, Caspian, Mongoloid, Mediterranean. Those are the players that we have when it comes to this little historical cinema. Now, we know that Proto-Australoids, they were Negro people with straight hair. Proto-Negroes, self-explanatory. Caspians, hey, that's a question mark. I hadn't even addressed that yet, but yeah, they were Negroes in the Caspian area. Mongoloids, those that came in were Negro Mongoloids. The Mediterranean people, well, you know that they were East Africans, Somalis and Oromo people and others of that East Africa area. Now, what you think happened? Honestly, ask yourself. You have all these people settling close to one another. Do you reckon that interaction took place, or did they just stay separate and in their own little bubble? Or did they just mingle with one another, do business with one another, hunt with one another, educate one another, so on and so forth? Yeah, they did that. They built civilizations. They built these different tribes, mingled and changed the dialect and whatever they came in, the knowledge they had, they shared with one another and improved upon it. So there you have it. Of course, I expect pushback, but to combat that, provide proof and tell the truth, and the chips fall where they may. So all future videos dealing with early Germanic peoples, the melanated populations, the Negro populations, we're going to talk about civilizations surrounding these territories, these geographic areas. We're going to discuss individuals. We're going to link it back because we're going to reinstall these people, man. They've been whitewashed. We're just going to, clean it up and show the originality of these people, the original peoples. So stay tuned for those. And guys, be safe, keep learning, take care.